I insist you stop having so much fun. We have a record crowd, and we need to get on with the show very happily. Before we get on with the show, I want to remind you that this is a double feature, and at 3 o'clock, on behalf of the Women's Studies program, Michael Greenberger will be speaking in this very room. There should be enough seats. It's free of charge, and you're most welcome to come. Michael Greenberger is right over there. Thank you. And I welcome all of you, old and new members of the Schemel Forum, to our third Worlds Affairs briefing of the fall semester. To date, we've had the most revealing insights into the enigma that is Iran that I've heard, focusing on the U.S.-Iran relationship, and then a glimpse of cultural diplomacy and its particular significance at this moment in history. Today, we turn to a subject that has become, to our surprise and regret, at the forefront of our nation's concern and a complex and demanding challenge with regard to both domestic and foreign policy. We're extremely fortunate to have with us today one of the leading experts on national security, a subject that has caused both panic and prognostication among us citizens and has fanned the flames of intolerance, too. It has required an immense amount of research and reevaluation by the experts. Even as warfare has taken on new forms and new meanings in our time, so has our national security. Today's speaker will aim to illuminate this very dark subject. Michael Greenberger is a law school professor and the founding director of the Center for Health and Homeland Security at the University of Maryland. The center works on a broad range of homeland security and emergency response issues for federal, state, and local governmental agencies, as well as medical researchers. He has designed and teaches 2 courses focused on counterterrorism and emergency response, which bring together students and faculty from the various university professional schools to study effective governmental policy pertaining to catastrophic public health emergencies. On the lighter side, I mean that somewhat, but not entirely ironically, he teaches constitutional law and seminar on futures, options, and derivatives at Maryland's Law School. A Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Lafayette College, Michael is also a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Law Review. And if that isn't enough distinction, he's a proud native of Scranton. Please help me welcome Michael Greenberger.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I want to say the proudest part and happiest part of that introduction is being a proud native of Scranton. I think if good things came from that, they must be attributed to my growing up. I actually grew up a few blocks from here, 705 Madison Avenue, which is now a prominent parking lot for Mercy Hospital. I, as Marcia will tell you, who has spent a great deal of time in Scranton herself, I have a special place in my heart for the city and its institutions, and I'm not alone in that feeling. I know so many people who've either still live in the metropolitan region or who've gone away always say that it was a wonderful, wonderful place to grow up, and the institutions were very supportive. And I am in the debt to this community. I also have a very strong affection for the University of Scranton. My uncle graduated in 1950 from St. Thomas College. His son is a graduate of the University of Scranton. Gail Kennedy Keating, who is a classmate of mine at Scranton Central, will corroborate the fact that many Scranton Central graduates came to the university. I've never met anybody who was displeased with their education, and many of them have gone on to great prominence. And I am forever indebted to the university for, even though I attended another university, I had to get 2 years of language in to graduate. And I never thought I would get second-year German done, but some kind professor at the University of Scranton spent a summer with me There happened to be other people in the class, but I became a special focus because of my inadequacies, and pulled me through German 2 at the University of Scranton, which if I had ever had to take biophysics, I would have taken it in the summer at the University of Scranton. It's the only way I would ever master a complicated subject. I know there's so much to talk about, and forgive me if I just give you a personal contextual history to how I got to the place I am today, which I think bespeaks of the terrific education I got in the public schools in Scranton. I attended Lafayette College in nearby Easton, Pennsylvania, and the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where I met my lovely wife. And I must say, Sandra, you continue to let Marcia have the last word just by speaking at 3 o'clock. That is a great education, really can make someone into a person who can adapt quickly to changing environments and changing skills. I was for 25 years a lawyer in private practice in Washington, D.C. I had a national litigation practice. I tried cases all over the country. I argued cases in every one of the nation's federal courts of appeals and in the Supreme Court. And after 25 years of doing that, I decided I needed a new challenge and went off to help a friend who became the chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission under President Clinton. I entered that job knowing not the first thing about commodities, and within 6 months I was in a furious argument with Alan Greenspan about financial regulation. At the time, people said, "Aren't you embarrassed to be publicly associated as being in an argument with Alan Greenspan and have that reported on the front page of the Wall Street Journal?" And my answer was, anytime my name is spelled correctly on the front page of the Wall Street Journal is good enough for me. My boss, Brooksley Born, and I embarked on a very major struggle, which we lost in the Clinton administration, to regulate very toxic financial instruments that have now been labeled as the cause of the financial meltdown we find ourselves in. If you're interested in the history of that, Frontline, about 6 months ago, did a 1-hour documentary called The Warning, which was at the fight that Brooksley Born and I lodged, trying to get these instruments regulated when they were in their infancy and before they caused the financial havoc that they caused. Because of that, I continue to be very interested in financial regulation, and that's sort of my second area of expertise. But today I'm here to talk about Homeland Security. And you may ask, how did I get involved in Homeland Security? Well, after I left the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, I was offered a job working with the then Attorney General Janet Reno on her personal staff. I went over there thinking that my expertise in litigation would be the foremost talent that would be used. And one day in February of 2000, I was sitting at my desk and I looked up, and there before me was the 6 feet 2 inch tall Janet Reno standing there, and she said to me that she had decided that I was so talented that she wanted me to take charge of orchestrating a national counterterrorism field exercise that would test the readiness of the Clinton cabinet to respond to simultaneous attacks, a biological attack in Denver by terrorists, a chemical attack in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and a radiological attack in suburban Washington, D.C. And I said, "You got to be kidding. I know nothing about this." And she said, "You'll be fine." And that launched me in orchestrating this very complicated, on-the-ground field exercise, which took place at the end of May 2000. One reason it's interesting to recall that is everybody thinks that our worry about terrorism began on September 11, 2001, and that's not correct. In fact, President Clinton, Sandy Berger, his national security advisor, his aide, Richard Clark, who's now achieved his own fame in the counterterrorism world, the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Janet Reno, the Attorney General, were very worried about al-Qaeda, attacks on al-Qaeda. We'd had the attacks on the African embassies in 1998. Later, there was the attack on the USS Cole. And it was a very vibrant concern, and I make no partisan comment on this because the Republican-controlled Congress was every bit as concerned about it. And the very reason I was required to do this exercise was the Republican-controlled Congress made it a rider on the Justice Department appropriation that this exercise be done. So this concern is a longstanding concern. It predated 9/11. I think the 9/11 Commission made a very delicate but persuasive, tactful, delicate but persuasive case that we may have had enough information on the ground to have headed off the 9/11 attacks had that administration been up and running and more ready to deal with those kind of events. I left the administration in January of 2001. I was fortunate to get a one-year appointment to the University of Maryland School of Law faculty. I was retained to be a very conventional law professor. I taught contracts, constitutional law, and trademarks. By the way, I knew nothing about trademarks. But the option was teaching a first-year law writing course for 25 students where you had to read their papers 4 times within a semester and go over the papers with them. And they offered me the option of teaching trademarks to 9 students who are doing that. And I said, trademarks any day of the week. I'm very proud that I got very high student ratings for doing that because I was 50 pages ahead of the class throughout that semester. In any event, I started July 1st, 2001. The 9/11 attacks happened that September. The experience I had gained in the Justice Department and the knowledge I had and the contacts I had enabled me to appear to be, and appearances are important, an expert in this very new and burgeoning area of Homeland Security. I created a course called Homeland Security and the Law of Counterterrorism, which I taught for 10 semesters, which dealt with the Patriot Act and Guantanamo Bay and enemy combatants and warrantless wiretapping, et cetera. But a very lucky break for me was that the president of the university at that time decided that he wanted to have within his office a think tank on Homeland Security issues. Now, the University of Maryland Law School is in Baltimore, and it is surrounded by a very intense medical research environment. The University of Maryland Medical Center I can see out of my office. The University of Maryland School of Medicine is right down the street from that. The nursing school is there, the pharmacy school is there. It's a very, the law school is sort of the odd thumb out on that campus, but it has a very strong health orientation. The president was a medical researcher himself, and he wanted the center to focus on the health consequences of catastrophic events such as terrorist attacks. I should say that we think often, and I will speak briefly, about the need to prevent terrorist attacks, and either through diplomacy, military policy, intelligence operations, surveillance, police work is a methodology of preventing terrorist attacks. But as serious a problem as preventing a terrorist attack is what you do after you have a terrorist attack, especially using weapons of mass destruction, which, thank goodness, except if you argue about the anthrax problems in the fall of 2001, and anthrax is a biological pathogen that can be weaponized and can be a weapon of mass destruction. We've been blessed by not experiencing an attack with a weapon of mass destruction. The 9/11 event itself, while it was traumatizing, was the use of a conventional weapon, airplanes as missiles, and even the kinds of episodes that we're seeing today, which I'm going to talk a little bit about some more. The Times Square bomber was the use of conventional explosives. Even the Christmas Day bomber, which if he had been successful and brought down that airline, would have been quite a dramatic event, but it was a very unsophisticated explosive weapon, and not a weaponized aerosolized spray of smallpox or plague or tularemia, or the use of choking gas, even chlorine, across a large area. And the most feared the most feared weapon of mass destruction of all is a nuclear weapon, which President Obama quite correctly said he lays awake at nights worrying about because it would be very hard to prevent and almost impossible to respond to. But any kind of attack with a weapon of mass destruction will have health consequences in its aftermath, how to care for people who, if you're talking about smallpox, those of you who are old enough to remember smallpox, was a very frightening and ugly and a disease with a very high morbidity rate. What do you do if people should suddenly get smallpox again or plague or something like that? And that really became my principal focus at the center, is the response to these events. Now, from September 11, 2001 to late August 2005, when anybody thought about Homeland Security in a conventional sense, they thought about terrorism. In August of 2005, when the levees broke in New Orleans, we suddenly were introduced to the fact that the Homeland Security apparatus not only has a concern for man-made catastrophic events, but for natural catastrophic events. The Secretary of Homeland Security, Mr. Chertoff at the time, was, although it was hard to tell, was the top federal lead in the response to Hurricane Katrina. The federal government had a very big role. For the first time since the Civil War after 9/11, we had within the United States a military command that was responsible for the defense of the United States. That is called NORTHCOM. NORTHCOM, if things had gone well in terms of leadership in August of 2005, was poised to come into New Orleans to restore, in essence, a Republican form of government, because there was no form of government. And there was widespread chaos, looting, criminal activity. The police force was immobilized by the flooding. There was a very, very long debate, and I could talk about this at length, about whether the active military could be used to go into New Orleans, even over the objection of the Louisiana governor. The answer to that question, by the way, is yes. The Clinton administration had answered that question yes when I was there. It took the government 3 days, the Bush administration 3 days to answer the question yes. By that time, havoc had been wreaked on New Orleans, and it was almost too late to do any good. But these are the kinds of response issues that we now associate, not necessarily man-made, but naturally occurring events, which you and I have experienced in spades. If you look at the H1N1 episode, that it was all Homeland Security apparatus brought to bear in responding to H1N1. The BP oil spill brought to bear Homeland Security apparatus. Retired Admiral Thad Allen, who was the unified commander, was in command of the kind of governmental apparatus that would also be used to respond to a terrorist attack. So in the conventional world that I do my work, we are now focused on all hazards. That is to say, we have to be prepared to deal with man-made events, but we also, and we are more frequently called upon to deal with naturally occurring events. The last human interest point I would make about that is that we, as you may know from, I guess, Philadelphia to Richmond, had the worst winter snowstorms in history. We had a terrible storm in December, and then we were socked with back-to-back storms in the early part of February. It completely immobilized the region, including the region in which our national government has to function. And while I'm sure not a lot of thought was given to this by the public at large, but the very same apparatus that might be used to respond to that storm and react to it and enable people to get the resources they need to lead their daily lives were the creation at the state and local level of emergency operations centers, the same kind of emergency operations centers that would be used if we had had a terror attack using a weapon of mass destruction. So while many people think of this world as a terror world, and it is also, and probably because of global warming, but if you don't believe in that, whatever is happening, our weather patterns are cataclysmic, historical flooding, hurricanes, wildfires, what have you, and the Homeland Security apparatus at the federal, state, and local level is geared to address that problem. Now, the one substantive message I would just wanted to make in terms of talking about terrorism, terrorism policy, and the response to terrorism policy, after the 9/11 attacks, and even though it was overwhelming and from many psychological, physical, policy-wise very damaging, it was not the use of a weapon of mass destruction. As I said earlier, the greatest fear the government has is the use of a biological pathogen that would be either spread, contagious, and difficult to deal with disease with a high morbidity rate, or gas that would have a choking element. Next to a nuclear weapon, the most feared kind of attack is attacking facilities that store chlorine. And if there were a chlorine tank in New Jersey, in the near reaches to New York City, were attacked, that would almost cause as much damage to the New York metropolitan region in terms of morbidity as a nuclear attack would cause, because for those of us who have had contact just in very light touches with chlorine and swimming, you know that chlorine is an extremely deadly, choking event. If it were to be released generally, it would cause havoc over a metropolitan area. However, today, if life wasn't complicated enough, the greatest fear is not, or the greatest concern is not an attack using weapons of mass destruction. It is attack by, in fact, homegrown terrorists, people, for example, who are United States citizens, or in Europe, who are citizens of Western civilized countries, who, for one reason or another, have chosen to be trained by terrorist organizations and turn their weaponry, which is not a weapon of mass destruction, but something much less, like the explosives that were to be used by the Christmas Day bomber, like the explosives that were to be used by the Times Square bomber. These are not weapons of mass destruction, but they are weapons that would have mass consequences. I don't have to tell you that if there were a terror attack in a large shopping center anywhere in the United States, and there was a significant loss of life in the tens rather than the thousands, that would be front page news. That would cause people to think twice about shopping. Certainly if the airline in the Christmas Day bombing had gone down, it would have wreaked havoc on the airline industry, which was already at that stage very vulnerable. So you don't need, and the terrorist thinking is that you don't need to go through the trouble of developing some kind of sophisticated weapon, that you can do a lot of damage buying fertilizer and other chemicals in a hardware store, which, by the way, Timothy McVeigh, who was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing incident in 1995, that's all he really did. He was not only a United States citizen, but he had served in the United States military. I think nothing captures this concern as well as a paragraph I read, and I will read to you, from a Bipartisan Policy Center report assessing the terrorist threat, a report of the Bipartisan Policy Center's National Security Preparedness Group. This is to set strategy for responding to terrorism, and this is the opening paragraph of that report. Quote, "Mom, I'm in Somalia. Don't worry about me," was how 17-year-old Burhan Hassan's worried mother discovered where her son had gone weeks after he and 6 other Somali American youths disappeared from their homes in Minneapolis-St. Paul area shortly after Election Day 2008. Almost without exception, the youths who slipped away were described as good boys who were, quote, good students who had no problems with the law, close quote. But what especially troubled their relatives and others in the tight-knit immigrant community was that no one could explain how the impoverished young men were able to pay for the $2,000 airline tickets they used to travel to Somalia. Quote, my nephew, he doesn't have any money for a ticket, close quote, the uncle of one lamented. Quote, none of these kids do, close quote. According to a teacher of these children, he said, quote, up to now, no one knows who recruited them, but they obviously did not wake up one morning and decide to go to Somalia. I think that paragraph very emblematically explains the major concern that intelligence and counterterrorism officials have today. It is not an organized, synchronized, sophisticated attack by al-Qaeda of the kind we saw in 9/11, although we cannot rule that out. What we are experiencing today are individuals such as these young men, American citizens or American residents, who have become radicalized by one event or another and now seek to do damage to civil society in the United States. That is what was effectively the Christmas Day bombing incident. That was effectively what was the Times Square bombing incident in May of 2010. There was a Denver cab driver who was arrested in New York with plans to blow up subways in New York City, a lawful U.S. resident. The Army major / psychiatrist at Fort Hood was not only a U.S. citizen, but a U.S. citizen who achieved distinction not only in his education, but his military rank, who'd been radicalized by yet another American who now lives in Yemen, who is orchestrating many of these U.S.-led attacks. So on top of a concern for weapons of mass destruction, the Western democracies today, their greatest fear is not an organized attack, synchronized, sophisticated attack by al-Qaeda, but these either what are called lone wolves, or very loosely structured terrorist cells who seek to do damage to the United States. Now, we're very, very lucky that so far, not lucky, maybe more than luck, maybe good policy too, has kept us from these episodes. It is interesting that the Christmas Day bombing demonstrated practically every bad mistake the government could make in trying to prevent a terror attack. And before I list those mistakes, I want to say that President Obama quickly led a very detailed, sophisticated review of government policy, and I think many of the things that went wrong and led to the possible Christmas Day bombing have, to my view, been to a great deal improved, and the likelihood of those mistakes being made again are very rare. But what were those mistakes? The Christmas Day bomber bought a one-way ticket from Europe to the United States using cash. That is a classic red flag. Using cash, one-way ticket, that should be alerting everybody. His father had reported to Nigerian, his father was a very respected businessman in Nigeria, and reported to the Nigerian government that he was worried about his son, that his son might do something. That information actually made its way back to the United States, but never found its way into a centralized intelligence operation. And also, he had been turned down for a visa in the United Kingdom because he was thought to be unstable and likely to engage in terrorist activities. And the question arises, if the United Kingdom knew enough to deny him a visa, why didn't the United States deny him a visa? This was a very embarrassing situation, but I believe today that government policy, the intelligence apparatus, even though Congress insisted that the apparatus be unified, somebody knew about the father complaining in one intelligence branch and didn't get it out to the general information. That has been worked upon and will be improved, and I can discuss that more in questions and answers. Another great fear that time doesn't permit to delve into detail, but I do want to emphasize, is if you scratch a counterterrorism expert and say, what are the kinds of things you worry about? Very high on that list are issues of cybersecurity. That is that software, internet applications that we depend upon to run our electricity grids, run our hospitals, sustain life-saving equipment that the elderly are on, run businesses, run our checking accounts, run our banking accounts, could be brought down, brought to a stop, and possibly used in a way that would not only prevent it from being a positive help to society, but being used in a way where it would be a destructive use of society. The ability to protect against that is in its infancy stages. The Department of Homeland Security is now advising people, I don't think it's gotten enough publicity, about securing your own computers, your own softwares, whether it be personal or not personal. One of the most frightening things that happened over the last month, something that became public, is a software virus called Stuxnet. And that is a virus that somebody was able to infect Iranian software with. It's very sophisticated, moving from very private personal computers to more sophisticated computers, and then to the computers that are at the heart of the Iranian nuclear development project. The suspicion is that either Israel or the United States, and no one knows the correct answer to this, devised this form of cyber warfare to stop the Iranian nuclear development. Whatever it is, it's like the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was instrumental in ending World War II and saving lives. You may think as a policy purpose, it is smart to try and stop the Iranians from building nuclear weapons, but that very weapon can be turned against us and be very damaging to our way of life. And this is another central concern of our Homeland Security apparatus. With the few minutes that remain to the main presentation I'm making before we open to questions, I did want to reiterate the point that the Homeland Security apparatus is not only designed to prevent terrorist attacks, but it's designed to respond to catastrophic events, whether they be man-made or natural events. The frontline protection we have in that regard is state and local government, state police, local police, fire departments, emergency medical technicians, public health officials, medical personnel, people who run hospitals. There is a tremendous amount of work where those governmental institutions are becoming sophisticated in being able to do everything from responding to the consequences of a terrible terrorist attack or helping Baltimore, D.C., and Richmond, Virginia get out of the worst snowstorm in 100 years. The problem in that area is that the financial crisis that we are now experiencing, and as you well know as taxpayers at local, state, and federal level, tax revenues are way down, and besides the teaching professions, where classrooms are being dramatically increased because of a limit of public ability for public expenditures, the police, fire, and emergency medical technicians and support for hospitals is being cut. At the same time, the demand on those resources is being increased. And that is a very sad conundrum that we face today. The meltdown has not only affected us in terms of our jobs and our pensions, but may very well hurt us when we call upon our government responders to help us. And the final point I would make is this. For anybody who's been in an emergency and calls upon services to be rescued, and let's go back to the rather humdrum conventional situation of the record-breaking snowstorms in early February, the first persons that are called are government officials. They are who we expect to rescue us in that problem. By the way, I should add, the H1N1 pandemic turned out not to be, thank God, as serious as predicted, but there was great fear over it. And I was talking to a group last night and said, the Obama administration has never asked for praise, and they have not gotten praise. But one of the most miraculous things that happened was the ability to develop a medical countermeasure, the H1N1 vaccine, in a matter of months, bring it to market, and have it be a safe and effective product. Without government leadership, that never would have happened. And so I close these remarks by saying, when people tell you they want smaller government, they want you to pay less taxes, think about the times you need for yourself, your family, your friends, to pick up the phone and have important parts of the government come to rescue you. Those parts of the government are in peril today because of the financial situation and because of the political attack saying that government is bad, we should strangle government and get rid of it. Thank you very much. So with that,
I'm happy to take your questions. I'm sure there are some.
yes.
All of the terrorists that I read about are young men. And have we thought about what in our culture doesn't offer young men the kind of activity or interest or passion that might eventually take up some of the energy that's now going into terrorism?
Well, let me say that a lot of thought is being given to that. I don't pretend to be an expert on that part of dealing with this problem. But I will say I am very concerned about economic issues. And I will say this, in an economy where we have young people are taking the brunt of unemployment. In my own world, law students borrow a fortune to get law degrees and then can't find jobs. And I think that's a problem that's universal. Young people cannot sustain their own way of life and are returning to their parents' homes and living in their parents. In an era where there is no constructive outlet, getting a job, earning an income, having health benefits, fringe benefits, I think these people are very, and certainly this is not run-of-the-mill, it's not everybody, but there are enough people who are disaffected, disappointed, and find some sort of comfort and guidance from the worst element of civilized society. And until we are able to turn our economy around, and it's not just ours, it's Western Europe, and by the way, France and Germany and England, they have a bigger problem in this regard than we do. You may remember that the State Department was warning people not to go to Europe not because of US problems, but right now France is on high alert because the Saudis, who by the way themselves are under deluge from terrorist attacks, much more so than any Western country, have warned the French that there is going to be some unnamed serious terrorist attack in France. So it's not just our problem, and the economic problem we're experiencing is not a United States problem, it's a worldwide problem. I think there are strategies to get us out of that. I'm very discouraged because I don't think those strategies are being deployed. But if you had higher employment rates, I think you'd see fewer of these people running to the Middle East for training, or Asia. Yes?
I have three questions. What are the strategies that we should be deploying to save our economy?
So you got right to the point.
We've ended that too soon.
Yeah, well, I told Sandra Myers that I should be invited back for a second lecture because I enjoy Scranton so much. And
Give us a preview.
well, this is really a very complicated subject. My own view is that the Bush and Obama administrations made a very serious error in judgment. And their view was, if we get the banks up and running, everything is going to be fine, that the banks are central to our economy. There is the top regulator in the financial regulator in the United Kingdom is a man named Lord Turner. And Lord Turner, in the fall of 2009, gave a lecture to a world gathering of the leading progressive economists. And in a nutshell, his point was the banks have no constructive purpose in our society, at least the large Wall Street banks. They are not lending. They're getting money at 0% from the Fed, and they're turning around and using high-speed trading techniques, which are essentially stealing signals for the way the market is going to go. They're trading ahead of the market and making a killing. If they don't make a killing and they collapse again, they're going to turn around and ask for the taxpayers to bail them out. There was a very highly recognized, I know Robert Kuttner was a speaker at the Schemel Forum. Robert and I think a lot of other leading progressive economic thinkers believed that those banks should have in some way, if they were resuscitated as private institutions, a condition of resuscitation should have been they don't trade proprietarily for their own account, which does nothing for us, and that they lend to reliable lendees money for businesses, homes, education, and everything else. The business sector today, at least the small business sector, is starved for financing. They cannot get it from the big banks. The second thing I would say is we have totally abandoned our faith in Yankee ingenuity. Our manufacturing infrastructure, our Thomas Edisons of this world, who could invent the comparable helpful inventions to the light bulb and other things, are ignored, underfunded. I always reference the fact that at the beginning of World War II, Roosevelt founded something called the War Mobilization Board, brought in $1 a year men. There were only men then. No women would work for $1 a year. And they turned the economy around on a dime, gearing the economy up to respond to the needs of the war. The classic thing is General Motors not making cars, making tanks. We really need that kind of focus on not a macro thing, oh, we'll give tax breaks to the rich, or we'll give general tax breaks to people who do research. But we've got to focus and find, we need inventions to counter global warming, to counter diseases. There's all sorts of our mass transit is in disarray. We have all kinds of inventions. I sort of think in terms of the iPod, which was something that revolutionized the world, made us all happier, but not really a terribly constructive tool to advancing our betterment of our life. We should be finding the equivalent of the iPod from medical countermeasures to respond to global warming, green energy, and there are a lot of very prominent businessmen who gave a lot of money to President Obama in 2008 who are offering these solutions and right now are being ignored.
Oh, let me ask my other question. The man in Yemeni, the American
Yes.
citizen, and the fact that nobody knew in advance all of this money that's going into Homeland Security did not have any idea that we would have a Christmas bombing or
Well,
bombing. But my question is, he's now being the government is trying to assassinate an American citizen, and his father is trying to, I think it would be ACLU and maybe other groups, trying to stop this, and the government. What is your view in terms of the relationship between our war policies, which are expanding at this point in secret into Somalia and the threat of terrorism?
Yeah.
I think they're closely linked.
Well, they may be closely linked, but I must say, I was saying last night when I was speaking to a smaller group from the university, I haven't read Woodward's book on Obama's wars, but I'm going to read it very soon, but I've read a lot of reviews about it. And I think embedded in that book is Obama's theory, which I think is very courageous and may come back to bite, but I think he's absolutely right. There are maybe 50 to 100 Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan. There are 200 to 300 supposedly across the border in Pakistan. His view was, when he was trying to decide what surge capacity should be, is this really the wisest use of our resources? Would we not be better off preparing ourselves at home, that is to say, catching the Christmas Day bomber, the Times Square bomber, than deploying these huge number of troops in terrible conditions with high levels of risk involved? They can't go to Somalia. We've already been to Somalia. We got thrown out of Somalia in 1993, Black Hawk Down. They're not going to send troops back to Somalia. They're not going to send troops to Yemen. The point is that you can't send troops everywhere there's a problem. And we can second guess Iraq and Afghanistan, but I do think if there are to be intelligent people running our policy, and when I see some of these Tea Party candidates, I question whether that's going to hold up forever. But if there are intelligent people of good faith, I think these military deployments are being called into question as not being worth the treasure and blood that they're involved with.
By whom? Who's calling it?
Well, President Obama seemed, if you read that part of Obama's war, he seems to be calling it into question.
According to Bob Woodward?
Yeah, but I mean, he's reporting his statements. But I'll tell you, in Congress, there's a lot, even by conservative hawks, there's a lot of, first of all, Iraq is off the board. It was a mistake. We're trying to get out of it, whatever. But the Afghanistan venture is being second-guessed by lots of people as not being worth the effort.
And is it the Military Commissions Act that empowers the president to do this assassination? What
No,
power?
the military.
And drugs after an American citizen.
I
In Yemen.
Yeah, I think it's the inherent power of the presidency is what's being relied on to protect the American public. Okay, yes.
I was curious, we have a situation in the state of Pennsylvania where Homeland Security, head of Homeland Security has resigned, I believe, and they're now questioning whether we need a head of Homeland Security. And in light of what you were talking about before about the decision and the decision-making and all the layers, I wonder, do we need state-level Homeland Security? And how do you solve that long delay between knowing the crisis and making the decision, can troops go in or?
Well, first of all, I don't know how Pennsylvania operates, but I'll tell you, in Maryland, Governor O'Malley's Homeland Security Director was intimately involved. I was saying last night, sometime during the worst of the snowstorms, 40 cars were missing between Frederick and Gettysburg on US 15. They couldn't locate 40 cars. And you can imagine, but the Director of Homeland Security in Maryland was on that case. I mean, the Director of Homeland Security was dealing with H1N1. There is a very vibrant, I can't say it's perfect, it may not be perfect, and maybe some people would say far from perfect, but there are so-called fusion centers, Joint Terrorism Task Force, that really operate with the muscle principally of the states and the cities. And you can always, it's hard to prove a negative and say, well, these operations have kept us safe. But I really do, I believe that there is an abandonment by Al-Qaeda for these sophisticated simultaneous attacks, because we do, however imperfect it is, we have set up an apparatus that guards against it. I come into contact with that apparatus on a daily basis, and I think it is, again, not perfect, but I would never abandon it. Now, I don't know this particular situation in Pennsylvania. It may be sui generis, but I think these people play a very important role, especially when you view Homeland Security as being a principal responder to catastrophic natural disasters.
Is there coordination though? Like there's a lot of coordination between
Well, there's a lot of coordination. Each federal district, I think there are 93 of them, have something called a Joint Terrorism Task Force, JTTF. And it is a fusion center of federal prosecutors, the FBI, intelligence agencies, state police, state intelligence, and local police too. Now, I'm sure in some of those 93 districts, they probably aren't all that effective. I'm very familiar with the District of Maryland, and I think it's very effective. And there is coordination. Is there enough? No. And the other problem is, as I said earlier, the resources of state and local government are a tremendous impediment to a vigorous use of our police, fire, and emergency medical community. Yes?
I want to piggyback on that. As a first responder, actually from Baltimore to 9/11, you know, at that time there was definitely some imperfections in regards to the communication system that we had with our response to, you know, different cities. What I've noticed too is it seems to be very fragmented from the citizen perspective of there was a lot of chaos, and I think it would still continue today. There's not a lot of preparedness from the citizen in regards to what their response is supposed to be in regards to an attack. I'm not sure if there's something that we could do to help further educate the normal citizen to respond and what they should do.
Yeah. You raise some very interesting points. First of all, the ability of first responders to communicate with each other was a classic problem in 9/11. The police couldn't tell the fire department to get out of the buildings before they collapsed. And there was a report a month ago in the New York Times that there hasn't been much improvement since then. But there's been a lot of, and I don't know, are you still in Baltimore now? And
No, I'm actually retired.
yeah. Well, we could use you back there, especially with what we're paying. You might volunteer your services. I must say, Governor O'Malley, I think it's today, he announced some big new initiative about approving the communications equipment across the state and having it fused with local equipment. We spend a lot of time, my center spends a lot of time working on, that's called interoperability. Do the communications equipment speak to each other from different levels of government within government? It's a very tricky technical problem. Obviously, New York, who, by the way, I have the highest degree of respect for in terms of their counterintelligence, counterterrorism community, is still having a problem. There's a lot of work being done on that. There is also a lot of work being done on informing the community in a timely fashion what the problem is and what the appropriate response is. A lot of thought is being given to that. The H1N1 episode throughout the country, and it was true in Maryland, pointed out a lot of flaws in that system, and in some sense was a silver lining because I know in Maryland, and I'm involved in this, a lot of time is being spent on communicating with the public. What is the problem? How can the problem be solved? And restoring calm or having a sense of calm be imbued. Yes.
Piggybacking on your comments and the question, and having studied this issue in Israel, the issue of terrorism, one of the very instructive things that I saw them do was to not only inform citizens, but also involve them. And what I found was 70,000 people, not part of the government apparatus in any way, would, after work, after school, moms, physicians, sort of participate with the government and do things to help to sort of add forces, and whether it was directing traffic so there weren't buses stopped on corners for too long and thus a bombing target, whether it was to take license plates, to file, to print things, to pass out literature. I've not seen that anywhere else in the world, but it's a very capable apparatus in Israel.
That's an excellent point, Joe. And another thing I would say that I failed to mention is the tremendous help citizens can be in the response. Secretary Napolitano is starting a program saying, see something, say something. Who got pinpointed the problem with the Times Square bomber? A vendor in Times Square noticed the smoke coming out of the car and knew enough to tell somebody about it. I always tell the story, we had this terrible episode in 2002 in our region with the sniper attacks, which was in its own sense a terror activity. 2 men terrorized from Philadelphia to Richmond, and I could speak a lot about that, including I was leaving Washington to go to Charlottesville to the University of Virginia to give a speech, and Marcia said to me, get your gasoline close by, don't stop in the middle of nowhere to get gasoline because people were being picked off at gas stations. The task force that addressed that problem found the license plate of the car that the snipers were using, and for some reason debated several hours about whether they should make that information public. Within an hour of making it public, some truck driver, I think on Interstate 70, between Baltimore and Hagerstown, saw the car parked in a parking facility, and that's how they found the snipers. So this story can be told time and time again. The average citizen has a role to play, and you shouldn't be shy about, if you see something that's out of the ordinary, say something to the appropriate person about it. Yes?
Do you have any comments on the usefulness of the recent warning concerning travel in Europe?
Frankly, I think it is useful. It's very sad. I'm very sad that we have to do something like that. But if you read today's paper and see what's going on in France, there's a great deal of concern about a possible terrorist attack. It's not just France, it's Germany. I think Sweden is involved as well, Japan. And I think, again, you should have enough information to make a decision about what you want to do. But if you do go, it's a signal to you to keep your guard up and be aware and watch for things and not be taken by surprise by something. I don't have access to the intelligence that is driving this, but it is clear to me that they have very good intelligence that has caused them to go to the extreme of issuing that warning. Sandra.
Well, before I ask my question, I would say, when they tell you to be careful if you go to Europe, I don't know exactly what that means. Do you?
Well, yeah.
I mean, you can't stand for it. Well, I don't know what it means.
Well, Sandra, you have to take me to Europe and I'll explain it to you.
Yeah, I ask another question that maybe it's inappropriate for you to answer. But if it isn't, I'd like to know something about the relationship between the center and public policy. Is there, do you do research that informs public policy, or exactly, let's say, on the medical side?
Well, yeah, I can. I definitely can talk about that. I mean, I told you the story about the president of our university had the idea to do this, and it's got this very unusual name, Center for Health and Homeland Security. People say, what led you to do that? Well, the dean of the medical school is the 800-pound gorilla in our campus, and he said, I want health to be very prominent in this if you support us. So we created this name. Without a strategic plan, what has ended up happening is that we have been asked by the state of Maryland, DC, Virginia, now we're doing work for all the Mid-Atlantic regional states by cities. We have this problem. We have funding from the federal government to fix this problem, but we need somebody to tell us how to fix it. The classic example is this interoperability problem, where across the state of Maryland, I'm sure it's true, and we know it's still true in New York, they've been given grants by the federal government to fix the problem. The fire should be able to talk to the police. They both should be able to talk to emergency responders. The city of Annapolis should be able to talk to the state of Maryland. We work with the people in the field to think through how these problems can be fixed. Another area that we're very much involved in is something called continuity of operations planning, which is that it is now not only good business practice, but good government practice to have a plan in place that if your main facility where you provide essential functions to the public goes down, that you be up and running in 12 hours in an alternate site and carry on for 2 weeks. We have written the continuity of operations plans for all the Maryland executive branches, DC executive branches, the court system, et cetera. And we develop policy in the sense of deciding how those plans should be written, but we are writing those plans and training people on how to write the plans. We've had problems. There was a big fire in the courthouse in Prince George's County. Now, when you're thinking about continuity of operations planning, you're thinking about terrorists storming the courthouse. Here was a conventional fire, but it put the courthouse out of business. You've got people on bail, criminal defendants seeking trial. How are they going to do that? Well, we have a plan for them to get up and running in 12 hours. So a lot of it is field and practical and applied information, but also within the structure of that, we develop policy. We do what we've been able to get funding to support. Most of our funding comes from the government. We don't have the luxury of having funding to do the kind of global research that we would be happy to do, but that hasn't been where our support has come from. Maury.
Michael, if you were free to completely do whatever you wanted, what improvements would you make to Homeland Security? If you adequately answer this question, I'll give you permission to go for Sandra Europe.
I was hoping you'd say I could go to Sandra to Europe and think through that question. Look, I will tell you something. The key to everything is leadership and having effective people in charge of organizations. I take the Department of Homeland Security as the prime example. There was a thesis that became law that if you took 22 different agencies and put them all under one roof, that the world would be fine. There was no concern about who was going to run those agencies, how those agencies would operate together. I think the Department of Homeland Security is a nightmare right now. Tom Ridge was the president's Homeland Security advisor. What I would like to have thought of is that somebody in the White House, having the imprimatur of the president, could have worked with those 22 agencies, not necessarily under one roof, and got them in operation. There's no policy, there's no organizational structure that can be the perfect answer. What is the perfect answer is wise, intelligent, good administrative people. And for example, taking the Department of Homeland Security, I'm very impressed with Janet Napolitano. I think she's doing a very, very good job. Having somebody like that running the department would be better than reorganizing the department to lead to a different thing. But you know, to me, who's the Secretary of Homeland Security? Who's the President's Homeland Security advisor? How involved is the President? Now, unfortunately, our President, President Bush, had the luxury of having terrorism be his #1 concern without a lot of distraction. This president has a faltering economy. He's worrying about global warming, health care, and terrorism, I fear, may have taken a backstage. And as I said, one of the silver linings of the Christmas Day incident was so many things went wrong and they were so obvious that it forced him to spend a considerable amount of time. And I think he has managed to make great improvement in the system so that we won't have those problems again. But it's the people. There's no silver bullet. Getting the best people at all levels of government working on these problems. Do I get to go to Europe? The answer was obviously not very good. Okay.
All right. You say if you see something that looks threatening, to speak up. On my way home, if I see something, whom do I call?
Well, the first thing I would do if there is, I don't know how Pennsylvania is set up. In Maryland, when you drive on the highways in Maryland, there are signs saying, if you see, I can't remember the exact word, if you see something suspicious, call 800, Now, I don't know whether you have that in Maryland, but the short answer is I'd call 911. Yeah, the police. I just say, you know, I see smoke coming out of a car, I see something, a suitcase that's left in the street, something that looks very strange. But I think, you know, we are all, I think, programmed to not step out and say things, cause alarm, be deemed a bit of a, you know, a complainer, but it is important now. And I think if you're not taken seriously, that's a reflection of the people you're calling the report into, not a reflection on you. Yes.
You've been concerned, we've all been concerned here today with the broad picture, and you've given us some wonderful, wonderful outline. On a smaller scale, but with greater ramifications, what's the situation with airline at the airports. This recent report of a pilot who refused the body check, the ramifications of that to our economy, to employment, to unemployment are humongous.
Well, every study I have read within the last 6 months, including this bipartisan report and a broad range, say that airport security is not only vastly improved within the United States, but because of the Christmas bombing, one of the problems the United States was having was, what do the foreign officials do to screen, like, if this person, I think it may have been Continental Airlines, but suppose it was a foreign airline where he shows up with cash for I mean, that in and of itself, cash one way, that guy should be body searched and everything else. Many European and other Asian foreign governments have now brought the United States security apparatus into those airports, and you're seeing this kind of screening by and large at both ends. It may be you go to a rare small country, you don't see it, but you do see it. I think airport security has reached a stage. It's never going to be perfect, but I think they've made substantial progress. There is, let me tell you something. I have just recently cut down my travel because I cannot stand airport security. You know, I feel like I'm getting undressed, you know, and holding my pants up without a belt and everything else. I think it's, every time I go to airport security, I say, Osama bin Laden, you really caused a lot of trouble. But it's effective, it's working. My own concerns, and even another concern, someone mentioned last night, port security, maritime security. You know, these containers are locked and shipped all over the world. You can't see what's inside them. But even there, the government has developed surveillance mechanisms that can detect biological, chemical ingredients that may be in them. We're doing a lot of work on port security. Again, it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what we were. I've been traveling a lot on Amtrak up and down the East Coast, especially from DC to New York. And the security in the train stations and on the trains is much better now than it's been in a long time. I don't know if any of you've taken the Acela, but there are people walk through with dogs through the trains. There are dogs and security people all through the train station. That was thought to be a very vulnerable part of our transportation system. I think there's been improvements. Yes?
Yeah. You mentioned about these terrorist attacks more randomly throughout society, and they have not occurred due to good policy and good law. And Joe mentioned about Israel, but Israel and Ireland have both instituted practices that have been reactive based on bombers on buses or in a garbage can or remote places like that. But then you mentioned too about being too alarmist. Do you think that the United States government should be out there a little bit more adopting some of those preventive?
Well, frankly, I think they're trying very hard to do things that sort. I was on a committee that was dealing with detection of explosives with a lot of high-powered, excluding me. Why I was on that committee, I don't know, but a lot of technical people working on detecting explosives and responding to it. So I think a lot of good work is being done in that area, but it will never be perfect. And I think not only right now is it not perfect, but it's not where I really think it should be. But I think that even in our stumbling, bumbling way, we've created enough obstacles to terrorists to make it much, much harder today than it's ever been before. And may very well be the reason that they're resorting to these more ad hoc, conventional ways. The final point you raise is, I think, an excellent one. I don't think this country is conditioned, it's when there is a suicide attack in Israel, it's certainly front page news, but people are conditioned not to view it as the end of the world, requiring a revamp of all policy and attitudes toward, the way things get done. I think if there were, there was, by the way, in the news last night, a very large shopping center outside of Sacramento, somebody locked himself in and set it on fire. That probably won't go down as a terrorist act, but if somebody had locked themselves in and exploded the place and had killed people, that would have been deemed a terrorist act. And I fear that the response would be too great for the episode that you're experiencing. For example, we're seeing all this unthinking attacks on Muslims, believing that every Muslim is capable of carrying out a terrorist attack, which I think is counter-constructive in the sense that we need the support of the Muslim community. Even if you leave aside the morality of discrimination on the basis of stereotyping, we need the support of the Muslim community in the United States. We need the support of the Muslim community, countries in the world. And having this thing, I'm not building at ground zero because it's for Muslims, and Muslims attacked us on 9/11. If we have an explosive and it's someone of color who's caused it and lives are lost in one shopping center somewhere in the United States, the reaction to that will be far too serious. And frankly, I think that's why President Obama was very courageous. I hope he understood that he was courageous when he said, I don't want to send troops to, he didn't quite say this, but the theme was, I don't want to send troops abroad. I'd rather try and protect us here. We can take some of these attacks and we can head off a lot of these attacks, and the price we pay is a lot less than sending young men to die in deserts in foreign countries in an effort that many people think is fruitless. Well, all I can say is when there is a terrorist attack, people will be saying, we should be in Somalia, we should be in Yemen, and we should put Muslims in holding facilities. There'll be that reaction, which I think will be very unfortunate.
I just wanted to follow up on Jane's question about airport security. I read that Israel screens people before they enter the terminal.
Yeah.
What do you think of that as a, because it seems logical that if you don't screen them until they get to the checkpoint, there's a lot of damage that can be done.
Well, you know, it might be a more effective approach. There's a cost-benefit analysis in it. I mean, people are already so turned off by travel that if you start having to take off your belt in your car as you go up to the airport, that's going to be the end of it. Yeah. So Israel, because of their heightened problems, I think has been very correct and effective in doing that. And I don't think we need to resort to that at this point.
Thanks, Michael, for giving us some insights into this very complex problem. We couldn't solve them all, but I think we've solved one. I think there's consensus that Michael and I should go to Europe together. But before we go, we do have a program next Wednesday. Goodwin Cook will be back with us again on a new topic for us, but an important one, China, and what we ought to know about China. So don't miss that one. And the last in the series will be Soraya, always forget her last name, this heroic woman, Paxit, a heroic woman from Afghanistan who has created an organization called Voice of Women. She was named in 2009 as one of the 100 most important people in the world by Time magazine. She's a wonderful speaker and a magnificent human being. We won't want to miss her. That's on November 16th. But meantime, I will see you next Wednesday. Thank you all for coming.